All right, let's talk about one of the most baffling and controversial figures of the 20th century, Padre Pio. This was a man who, for some, was a living, breathing saint performing miracles right before their eyes. But for others, he was a master of pious fraud. And get this, for over 50 years, the Catholic Church itself just could not seem to figure him out.
Everything, and I mean everything, revolves around this one incredible claim. From 1918 all the way to 1968, this humble friar in a remote Italian monastery had wounds that bled in the exact same places as Christ's on the cross. For 50 years, this phenomenon alone shot him to global fame and had millions of people flocking to see him.
So that's the big question we're digging into, right? How can one man be investigated for being a total fraud by one pope, only to be declared an actual saint by another? It's a wild story. We're going to break down the evidence, the accusations, and what he left behind.
To really get why this was such a huge deal, you have to understand the sheer scale of the supernatural gifts people said he had. I mean, it went way, way beyond just the bleeding wounds.
I mean, just look at this list. It's mind-blowing. The stigmata lasted for half a century, sure, but his followers also swore he could perform miraculous healings, things doctors couldn't explain. They claimed he could bilocate, literally be in two places at the exact same time. He supposedly had the gift of prophecy, and maybe the most personal one. People said he could read your heart, that he knew your sins before you even opened your mouth in the confessional. They even said his wounds gave off this scent of flowers, and some even claimed they saw him levitating during prayer. The whole shebang.
In stories like this one, this is what fueled the fire. He supposedly said this to the grandmother of a little girl named Gemma di Giorgi. The thing is, Gemma was born without pupils in her eyes. After meeting Padre Pio, they claimed she could suddenly see. These kinds of accounts spread like wildfire, building this incredible reputation as a true miracle worker.
But you can imagine, right? Claims this huge are going to attract some serious attention. And not just from skeptics, but from the very top of the Vatican. This wasn't some medieval legend. This was all happening in the 20th century, with cameras and newspapers and everything.
And when you look at the official record, it is a complete roller coaster. I mean, it's whiplash. One year, a doctor examines the wounds and says, yep, these are real, they're not just surface level. The very next year, a psychologist says, nope, he's just a hysteric with a weak mind. Then an official bishop's inquiry comes out and calls the stigmata a real fact. But flash forward a few decades, and another Vatican investigator shows up and concludes there is so much deception. The church was tearing itself apart over this guy.
So, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about the most serious accusations, the ones that had the Vatican so suspicious for so long.
While some people, like that psychologist, thought it might all be in his head, others were looking for a more physical, more deliberate explanation. And that led them to the number one theory for the skeptics, that the stigmata were self-inflicted wounds, kept open for 50 years with a corrosive chemical. And it all really boils down to this one incident. There was testimony from a local pharmacist's cousin who swore that Padre Pio had secretly bought carbolic acid. The accusation is pretty simple. He was using this stuff to burn open his own wounds. But Padre Pio had a totally different story. He said, yeah, he bought the acid, but it was to sterilize syringes during the Spanish flu pandemic. He also admitted to buying another chemical, Veritrine, but said it was just to pull a prank on the other friars. So you've got two completely conflicting stories. Who do you believe?
You know, this debate is still raging online today. His defenders will say, come on, carbolic acid for 50 years straight, are you kidding me? Medically, that seems impossible. You'd expect massive infections, tissue damage, you name it. But the skeptics fire back that, well, as crazy as it sounds, it's still a more believable explanation than an actual miracle.
And just when you think it can't get any more complicated, it does. Because it turns out the official Vatican verdict on Padre Pio often had less to do with the evidence and more to do with who was wearing the Pope's hat at the time.
Seriously, look at this. It's another roller coaster. You have Pope Pius XI, who reverses a ban on him, basically saying, oops, my bad, we were wrong about this guy. But then his successor, John XIII, becomes a huge skeptic. He finds out about secret listening devices planted in Pio's confessional and privately calls him a straw idol. Then Pope Paul VI comes along and just dismisses all the accusations. And finally, Pope John Paul II, who'd actually met Pio when he was a young priest, settles it once and for all by making him a saint. It's just incredible.
Okay, so let's put aside the stigmata, the miracles, and all the controversy for just a second. Because there is one part of Padre Pio's legacy that is solid, tangible, and something that even his biggest critics can't really argue with.
This is it, the home for the relief of suffering. In one of the poorest, most forgotten parts of southern Italy, Padre Pio led the charge to build this massive, state-of-the-art hospital, and it was funded entirely by donations, mostly small ones, from his followers all over the world.
And this quote was his vision. For him, the hospital wasn't just about science and medicine. He called it a clinic for the body and the soul. It was the physical embodiment of his whole ministry, a place for both prayer and healing. And today, it's a world-class medical center.
And if you want to see his ultimate vindication, at least in the court of public opinion, just look at this number. More than 300,000 people packed into Rome for his canonization mass in 2002. It was the final step in transforming him from this controversial friar under investigation into one of the most beloved saints in modern history.
And then, right at the very end of his life, there's one last mystery. The doctors who examined his body after he died reported that the stigmata, the wounds that had defined him for 50 years, were just gone. They had completely healed without leaving a single scar, as if they had never been there at all. So, where does that leave us? On the one hand, you have decades of eyewitnesses swearing they saw impossible things. Healings, bilocation, the works. On the other hand, you have serious, well-documented accusations of fraud backed by some Vatican investigations that concluded it was all a deception. And yet, totally separate from all that, you have the hospital, this undisputed, incredible force for good in the world. Which brings us to the final question. What really defines a saint? Is it their miracles, which might always be disputed, or is it their impact, which in this case is undisputed?